The fever had taken her without warning, swift and merciless as a dust storm. Gabriel Porter stood at the freshly dug grave, his hat clutched to his chest, the Montana wind whipping across the open prairie and stinging his reddened eyes. He hadn't cried, not properly, just stood there as the pine box containing his wife of 3 years had been lowered into the unforgiving earth. The year was 1878, and life in the territory was as harsh as it was beautiful. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Porter," Reverend Thompson said, placing a weathered hand on Gabriel's shoulder. Margaret was a fine woman. Gabriel nodded, not trusting his voice. Margaret had been more than fine, she'd been everything. The 26-year-old rancher had met her at a town social in Billings, courted her properly despite his awkward ways, and built the modest homestead they'd shared with dreams of filling it with children. Now, at 29, he stood alone, owner of 200 acres, 60 head of cattle, and a home that would never again hear her laughter. "If you need anything." The Reverend continued. "Thank you," Gabriel managed, his voice rough as sandpaper. "I'll manage." The small gathering of neighbors and acquaintances dispersed, heading back to their wagons and horses. Gabriel remained, boots planted in the rocky soil beside the grave. The simple wooden marker read, "Margaret Ann Porter, 1855–1878, beloved wife." "I don't know how," he whispered to the marker, "but I'll manage." 3 days later, Gabriel woke before dawn as always. The routine remained: stoke the fire, put on coffee, prepare to feed the livestock, but the purpose had vanished. No Margaret humming as she kneaded bread. No gentle teasing about his unruly brown hair. No warm body beside him in the night. He pulled on his boots, strapped on his gun, belt a necessity even on his own property, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The sun had not yet crested the eastern horizon, and stars still glittered overhead. His breath formed clouds in the chill, and frost crunched beneath his feet as he made his way to the barn. The work kept his hands busy, but left his mind free to wander dangerous paths. The fever had come so suddenly. Margaret had been fine one day, helping him mend fences along the north pasture, laughing as she handed him nails and burning up the next. Dr. Sullivan from town had come, prescribed willow bark tea and cool compresses, but the fever had raged unabated. Within 3 days, she was gone. Gabriel forked hay to the horses, filled water troughs, and checked on the pregnant mare in the far stall. All the while, his thoughts circled like vultures around the same painful memories. By midday, he'd finished the most pressing chores and found himself standing in the doorway of their cabin, staring at Margaret's rocking chair. Her knitting still sat in the basket beside it, a half-finished baby blanket they'd hoped would soon be needed. "Damn it all," he muttered, turning away. He grabbed his rifle from above the door and whistled for his dog. "Come on, Blue, let's check the fence line." The blue heeler bounded to his side, eager for the activity. Gabriel saddled his bay, gelding, Rusty, and they set out toward the western boundary of his property. The rugged terrain of Montana spread before him, rolling hills giving way to pine forests in the distance, the mountains beyond them still capped with snow even in late spring. The work of maintaining the ranch was endless, which suited Gabriel fine. Each exhausting day brought the mercy of sleep, though even that was often interrupted by dreams of Margaret calling his name. The fence line showed signs of tampering in 2 places. Gabriel dismounted and inspected the damage, finding fresh tracks in the soft earth. "Someone's been cutting my wire again, Blue," he said to the dog, who sniffed eagerly at the ground. "Looks like Wilson's pushing his luck." Thomas Wilson owned the adjacent property to the west. The man had been trying to buy Gabriel's land for the past year, making increasingly aggressive overtures after Gabriel repeatedly declined his offers. Margaret had stood firm beside him, insisting they would not be bullied off their homestead. "What would you do now, Maggie?" He asked the empty air as he repaired the fence. No answer came except the distant cry of a hawk. Gabriel returned to the cabin as dusk approached, bone-weary and soul-tired. He managed to cook a simple meal of beans and salt pork, feeding scraps to Blue, who watched him with knowing eyes. "Don't look at me like that," Gabriel told the dog. I'm doing the best I can. As darkness fell, he sat on the porch with a tin cup of whiskey, watching stars appear one by one. The vastness of the night sky had always made him feel small, but now it only emphasized his loneliness. He'd never been a man of many words, but Margaret had filled the silences with her gentle presence. Without her, the quiet was deafening. 4 weeks passed this way. Gabriel threw himself into ranch work, riding fence lines, moving cattle to fresh pasture, fixing the leaky roof, and trading minimal words with the occasional passerby or neighbor. On Sundays, he avoided town and the pitying glances of well-meaning townsfolk. He'd taken to talking to Blue as if the dog could understand every word, if only to hear a human voice his own in the emptiness of the cabin. Spring had fully given way to summer when Gabriel noticed smoke rising from the chimney as he returned from checking the eastern pasture. He reined Rusty to a halt, hand instinctively moving to his revolver. "What do you make of that, Blue?" he murmured to the dog, who had already raced ahead, barking. Gabriel approached cautiously, dismounting and tethering Rusty to a post some distance from the cabin. Drawing his gun, he advanced on foot, using the cover of a small stand of cottonwoods. The cabin door was open. Someone was moving inside. He could hear the scrape of furniture, the clatter of his cast iron cookware. Blue had gone silent, which puzzled Gabriel. The dog was trained to keep strangers at bay. Drawing closer, Gabriel caught the scent of something cooking, something that smelled remarkably like chicken soup. His stomach growled traitorously, reminding him he'd been existing on coffee and hardtack for days. He reached the edge of the porch and pressed his back against the rough-hewn log wall, listening. A woman's voice was softly speaking to Blue. "There's a good boy. You remember me, don't you? Is he taking care of you properly? You look a bit thin." The voice was familiar, yet impossible. Gabriel's heart pounded against his ribs so hard it hurt. Slowly, he turned and peered through the open door. Inside, stirring a pot on his cookstove, was a woman with honey blonde hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a simple blue dress, covered with one of Margaret's aprons. As if sensing his presence, she turned. Gabriel's gun clattered to the porch floor. "Rose," he managed, his voice barely audible. Rose Vernon, Margaret's younger sister, smiled uncertainly. "Hello, Gabriel." Gabriel stood frozen, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Rose had been living in St. Louis the last he'd heard. He hadn't seen her since his wedding to Margaret 3 years ago. "What are you doing here?" he finally asked, still not crossing the threshold. Rose gestured to the pot. "Making chicken soup. You look like you need it." It was such a simple, practical answer that Gabriel found himself momentarily speechless. Blue sat at Rose's feet, looking between them with canine curiosity. "I meant," Gabriel tried again, "what are you doing in Montana?" Rose's smile faltered. "I received your letter about Margaret. I came as soon as I could arrange passage." She wiped her hands on the apron. "I thought, perhaps you could use some help." Gabriel stepped into the cabin, suddenly aware of his appearance unshaven, clothes dirt-stained from days of work, hair too long and untamed. The cabin itself was in no better state. Dishes were piled in the wash basin, clothes draped over chairs, dust coating every surface Margaret had once kept spotless. "I didn't write to you," he said, confusion evident in his voice. Rose frowned. "The letter was signed with your name." "It arrived 6 weeks ago." Gabriel shook his head. "Must have been Reverend Thompson or Mrs. Hawkins from town. They've been concerned." An awkward silence fell between them. Gabriel hadn't seen Rose since his wedding day, but he remembered her clearly. 2 years younger than Margaret, she shared her sister's delicate features, but had always been the more spirited of the two. Where Margaret had been gentle and soft-spoken, Rose had a directness that some found off-putting. "How long have you been here?" Gabriel asked, noticing for the first time that the cabin floor had been swept, the windows washed. "I arrived on yesterday's stage to Billings. Mr. Hawkins was kind enough to drive me out this morning." She turned back to the stove. "The soup will be ready soon. There's water heating if you'd like to wash up." The simple domesticity of the scene, a woman cooking in his kitchen, the smell of food, the clean floor hit Gabriel with unexpected force. His throat tightened and he turned away abruptly. "I need to see to Rusty." he said gruffly, escaping back outside. In the barn, Gabriel unsaddled his horse with unsteady hands. His mind raced with conflicting emotions: anger at the presumption of whoever had written to Rose, discomfort at having his private grief invaded, and beneath it all, a shameful relief at the presence of another human being in his home. "This won't do," he told Rusty as he brushed the gelding's coat. "She can't stay here, it wouldn't be proper." But as he worked, the scent of chicken soup wafted into the barn, reminding him how long it had been since he'd eaten a proper meal. By the time he'd finished with Rusty and washed his hands and face at the pump outside, his resistance had weakened considerably. When Gabriel re-entered the cabin, Rose had set the table with 2 bowls of steaming soup, fresh bread, and butter. She'd found Margaret's good china, the set they'd received as a wedding gift and rarely used. "You didn't need to use those," he said, still hovering near the door. "They were gathering dust," Rose replied simply. "Please sit, you look half-starved." Gabriel sank into his chair at the table, suddenly aware of how exhausted he truly was. Rose sat across from him, her blue eyes so like Margaret's yet somehow entirely different, watching him carefully. "Thank you," he managed before taking a spoonful of the soup. The flavor burst on his tongue: rich chicken broth, vegetables from what must have been Margaret's garden, herbs he didn't recognize. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until that moment. They ate in silence for several minutes. Gabriel stole glances at Rose between spoonfuls. She'd grown into her features since he'd last seen her. At 25, she had the same heart-shaped face as Margaret, but there was a determination in the set of her jaw that was entirely her own. "The garden's doing well," she said eventually. "I picked some vegetables this morning." "The rest will be ready to harvest soon," Gabriel nodded. He hadn't tended the garden since Margaret died, hadn't even thought about it. "I can't offer you proper accommodations," he said abruptly. "The nearest town with a hotel is Billings." Rose set down her spoon. "I'm not leaving, Gabriel." "You can't stay here. Why not?" "It wouldn't be proper. A single woman, a single man." "I'm your sister-in-law," Rose interrupted, "and you clearly need help. Look at yourself, Gabriel. Look at this place." Gabriel bristled. "I'm managing fine." "You're existing," she corrected. "That's not the same thing." He wanted to argue but found he lacked the energy. Instead, he asked, "How long do you plan to stay?" "As long as needed." Her gaze was steady. "I promised Margaret I'd look after you if anything ever happened to her." Gabriel's spoon clattered against his bowl. "When did she ask that of you?" "In her last letter to me. She wrote that she was worried about a fever spreading through the area." Rose's voice softened. "She asked me to come if the worst happened, said you'd never ask for help yourself." Gabriel pushed away from the table, chair legs scraping harshly against the wooden floor. "She had no right to ask that of you." "She was my sister," Rose said simply, "and she loved you." Gabriel turned away, unable to bear the compassion in her eyes. "You can stay the night." "I'll sleep in the barn. Tomorrow I'll take you back to town." Without waiting for her response, he strode to the door, pausing only to grab his hat. "Blue, come," he commanded. The dog looked between Gabriel and Rose, clearly torn, before reluctantly following his master. In the barn, Gabriel made a bed of clean straw in an empty stall. Blue curled up beside him, sighing heavily. "Don't you start," Gabriel muttered to the dog. "She can't stay here." But as he lay in the darkness, the memory of the clean cabin, the hot meal, and Rose's steady presence worked on him like a salve on a wound he hadn't known was still raw. For the first time in weeks, he slept without dreaming of Margaret's final, fever-bright days. Gabriel woke to the sound of chickens being fed and the smell of coffee. For a disorienting moment, he thought Margaret was alive, that the past weeks had been a terrible nightmare. Then reality crashed back and he remembered Rose was here. He sat up, straw clinging to his clothes, and ran a hand through his disheveled hair. Blue was already gone, the traitor. Gabriel pulled on his boots and stepped out into the early morning light. Rose stood in the chicken yard, scattering feed from her apron. She'd found one of Margaret's old straw hats to shield her face from the sun, and the sight of it atop her blonde head gave Gabriel pause. From a distance, the resemblance to Margaret was striking enough to make his heart clench. As if sensing his gaze, Rose looked up and waved. Gabriel nodded awkwardly in return, then headed for the water pump to wash his face. The cold water shocked him fully awake, and he steeled himself for the conversation to come. In the kitchen, a pot of coffee waited on the stove, along with a pan of biscuits keeping warm in the oven. Gabriel poured himself a cup and sat at the table, rehearsing what he would say when Rose came in. He didn't have to wait long. The door opened and Rose entered, carrying a basket of eggs. She'd shed the hat and her cheeks were flushed from the morning air. "Good morning," she said brightly. "I hope you don't mind that I fed the chickens. They were making quite a racket." "That's fine," Gabriel replied stiffly, "but we need to talk about arrangements." Rose set the egg basket on the counter and turned to face him. "I've been thinking about that. The cabin has 2 rooms. I can take the small one off the kitchen. It would be perfectly proper." Gabriel frowned. "That's the storage room. It has a window and enough space for a bed. I've already looked." "Rose, Gabriel," she interrupted, her tone firm but kind, "I'm not leaving, not until I know you're all right." "I am all right," he insisted. Rose raised an eyebrow, glancing pointedly at his rumpled appearance and the state of the cabin, which, despite her efforts yesterday, still showed signs of weeks of neglect. "Fine," he conceded. "I'm not at my best, but that doesn't mean you need to append your life." "I haven't appended anything," Rose said, pouring herself a cup of coffee and joining him at the table. "I've been working as a teacher in St. Louis, but school's out for summer. I have nowhere pressing to be until September." Gabriel eyed her suspiciously. "And then what? You'll just leave?" "If that's what you want, yes." She met his gaze steadily. "But for now, I'm staying. You can sleep in the barn if it makes you feel better, but it seems foolish when there's a perfectly good bed going unused." Gabriel sighed, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw. Margaret had had the same expression when she'd made up her mind about something. 2 months, he said finally, "then you go back to St. Louis." A small smile played at the corners of Rose's mouth. 2 months, she agreed. "Now, would you like some eggs with your biscuits?" That settled, Gabriel found himself in the strange position of sharing his daily routine with someone again. After breakfast, he showed Rose around the property, the barn, the chicken coop, the small vegetable garden, the corrals, and the pastures beyond. "It's beautiful," Rose said as they stood on a rise overlooking the eastern meadow where a dozen cows grazed with their calves. "I can see why Margaret loved it here." Gabriel nodded, throat tight. "She helped choose the spot for the cabin. Said she wanted to see the sunrise over those hills every morning." Rose glanced at him, a question in her eyes, but seemed to think better of asking it. Instead, she said, "I'll need to go to town for supplies if I'm to stay. The pantry's nearly empty." Gabriel realized he hadn't been to town in weeks, subsisting on what little remained of Margaret's carefully stocked provisions and whatever game he could hunt. "I'll hitch up the wagon," he said. "We can go this afternoon." In town, Gabriel was acutely aware of the curious glances and whispered conversations as he helped Rose down from the wagon in front of the general store. Billings was small enough that news of Rose's arrival had clearly preceded them. "Mr. Porter," Mrs. Hawkins called, hurrying across the street. "And Miss Vernon, how lovely to see you settled in." Gabriel nodded stiffly. "Mrs. Hawkins." "I'm so glad my letter found you, Miss Vernon," the older woman continued. "We've all been so worried about Mr. Porter rattling around in that cabin all alone." Gabriel felt heat rise in his neck. "You sent the letter?" Mrs. Hawkins had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Well, yes, dear, after the funeral when you wouldn't accept any help. I remembered Margaret mentioning her sister in St. Louis. I took the liberty of writing." "It was kind of you," Rose interjected smoothly, placing a restraining hand on Gabriel's arm. "And I'm grateful. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have some shopping to do." Inside the store, Gabriel stood awkwardly by the door while Rose consulted a list she'd prepared. He watched as she efficiently selected flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples, adding lengths of fabric, thread, and buttons to her purchases. "What are those for?" he asked, nodding to the fabric. "Curtains," Rose replied simply. "And I'll need something to wear besides this one dress. I only packed for a short visit, not an extended stay." Gabriel realized he hadn't considered such practical matters. Add it to the account, he told Mr. Peterson, the storekeeper. And we'll need feed for the chickens and some salt blocks for the cattle. As they loaded their purchases into the wagon, Reverend Thompson approached, his face lighting up at the sight of Rose. "Miss Vernon, what a blessing to see you here," he said, extending his hand. "I'd heard you'd arrived." "Will you be staying long through the summer?" Rose replied with a smile. "I'm helping Gabriel with the ranch." The Reverend's eyes twinkled. "Wonderful, we'd be delighted to see you both at church on Sunday." Gabriel, who hadn't set foot in the church since Margaret's funeral, opened his mouth to decline, but Rose spoke first. "We'll be there," she said firmly. "Thank you, Reverend." On the ride home, Gabriel couldn't contain his irritation. "You didn't need to accept that invitation." Rose adjusted her bonnet against the late afternoon sun. "A little community would do you good, Gabriel, and me as well. I'd like to meet the people Margaret wrote about in her letters." Gabriel fell silent, hands tightening on the reins. The mention of Margaret's letters reminded him of how little he knew about the correspondence between the sisters. What had Margaret told Rose about their life together? About him? That night, after a supper of fried salt pork and potatoes, Rose announced her intention to clean out the storage room. Gabriel found himself helping her move boxes of Margaret's belongings into the main room. "We can sort through these later," Rose said gently, noting the way Gabriel's hands lingered on a box containing Margaret's winter clothes. He nodded, not trusting his voice. The room was small but had a window that faced west, catching the last rays of the setting sun. An old cot that had been stored there was dragged out and dusted off. "It'll do nicely," Rose declared, surveying the space. "A little cramped, but I don't need much room." Gabriel stood awkwardly in the doorway. "I'll bring in your trunk from the wagon." When he returned with the small trunk containing Rose's belongings, she had already swept the room and was laying out one of the blankets she'd purchased on the cot. "Thank you," she said, taking the trunk from him. "I'll be comfortable here." Gabriel nodded, then hesitated. "I usually check the livestock one more time before turning in." "Of course," Rose replied. "Don't mind me. I'll finish setting up here and then probably read for a while." Gabriel escaped to the familiar routine of the evening check, walking through the barn to ensure all was well with the horses, closing up the chicken coop, and walking the perimeter of the nearby corral. The physical activity helped settle his unease. When he returned to the cabin, Rose had lit a lamp in her small room. Through the partially open door, he could see her seated on the edge of the cot, brush in hand, her blonde hair falling in waves down her back as she prepared for bed. The simple intimacy of the scene, a woman in his home, preparing for sleep, sent a pang through Gabriel that was both familiar and strange. He turned away quickly, dousing the main lamp and retreating to his own room. For the first time in weeks, he slept in his bed rather than falling exhausted onto the pallet by the fireplace or bedding down in the barn. The sheets had been changed. He realized Rose must have done that while he was out checking fence lines earlier. They smelled of soap and sunshine rather than dust and grief. Gabriel lay awake long into the night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving about in his home. Eventually, Rose's lamp went out and silence fell over the cabin. Only then did Gabriel allow himself to close his eyes, drifting into a sleep unmarred by the usual nightmares. The days began to take on a rhythm. Gabriel would rise before dawn, start the coffee, and head out to begin the morning chores. By the time he returned, Rose would be up, cooking breakfast and planning her day's work. They would eat together mostly in silence, then part ways Gabriel to the endless tasks of the ranch, Rose to the domestic sphere of the cabin and garden. In the evenings, they would share a meal that grew increasingly more elaborate as Rose replenished the pantry and expanded the garden. Afterward, Gabriel would sit on the porch with his pipe while Rose sewed or read by lamplight inside. Sometimes she would join him on the porch, and they would sit in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge. True to her word, Rose insisted they attend church that Sunday. Gabriel put on his one good shirt and the black suit he'd worn to Margaret's funeral, uncomfortably aware that it hung more loosely on his frame than it had 2 months ago. You look fine, Rose assured him as they prepared to leave. She wore a simple dress of light blue cotton, her hair neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet. Just remember to breathe. The church service was a trial for Gabriel. Every pew, every hymn, every prayer reminded him of the last time he'd been there standing beside Margaret's casket. But Rose's steady presence beside him anchored him to the present, her clear voice joining in the hymns, her hand occasionally brushing his arm in silent support. After the service, they were surrounded by well-wishers and curious neighbors, all eager to speak to Rose and see how Gabriel was faring. Rose handled the attention with grace, deflecting the more intrusive questions and keeping the conversations light. Miss Vernon, Mrs. Peterson, the storekeeper's wife, said as they prepared to leave, "We'd love to have you join Our Ladies' Aid Society. We meet on Wednesday afternoons to sew and prepare care packages for those in need." Rose smiled warmly. "I'd be delighted, Mrs. Peterson. Thank you for the invitation." On the ride home, Gabriel said, "You don't have to do that, you know, join their sewing circle." Rose shrugged. "I'd like to. I enjoy sewing and it would be nice to make some friends here." She glanced at him. "Unless you object," Gabriel shook his head. "No, it's fine. I just don't want you feeling obligated to take on Margaret's role in the community." A shadow crossed Rose's face. "I would never presume to take Margaret's place in the community or anywhere else." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Gabriel focused on the road ahead, unsure how to respond. Rose turned her face away, looking out over the rolling landscape, and they completed the journey in silence. June gave way to July, bringing with it scorching days and the hard work of haying season. Gabriel hired 2 hands from town to help with the cutting and baling, working from dawn until dusk to get the hay in before any summer storms could damage it. Rose kept the men fed, rising early to prepare substantial breakfasts and packing lunches they could eat in the fields. In the evenings, she would have dinner waiting when they returned, sweaty and exhausted from the day's labor. One particularly hot afternoon, Gabriel came to the house for more water jugs. He found Rose in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up, hair escaping its pins as she worked over a hot stove preparing the evening meal. Sweat beaded on her forehead and neck, dampening the collar of her dress. "You should rest," he said, noticing the flush in her cheeks. "It's too hot for cooking." Rose turned, surprised by his presence. "The men need to eat," she said simply, "and so do you." Gabriel frowned. "Not at the expense of your health." Margaret, he stopped abruptly, the comparison dying on his lips. Rose's eyes flickered with something hurt, understanding. She turned back to the stove. "I'm fine, Gabriel. The water jugs are there, freshly filled." Gabriel took the jugs, lingering in the doorway. "I didn't mean it's all right," Rose interrupted, not looking at him. "I understand I'm not Margaret." The words hung in the air between them. Gabriel wanted to say something, to explain that he hadn't meant it as a criticism, but the right words eluded him. Instead, he took the water and returned to the fields, the conversation weighing on him throughout the afternoon. That evening, dinner was a quiet affair. The hired hands, oblivious to the tension, complimented Rose on the meal and retired early to the barn where they were sleeping during haying season. Gabriel remained at the table, watching as Rose cleared the dishes. "Let me help," he said, standing to gather the remaining plates. Rose looked surprised but nodded. They worked side by side at the wash basin, Gabriel washing while Rose dried and put away. The simple domesticity of the task eased some of the awkwardness between them. "I'm sorry about earlier," Gabriel said finally, handing her the last plate. "I wasn't comparing you to Margaret, I was just concerned." Rose nodded, carefully placing the plate on the shelf. "I know, and I shouldn't have been so sensitive." She turned to face him, her blue eyes serious. "But Gabriel, you need to know I'm not trying to replace her. I couldn't, even if I wanted to." "I know that," Gabriel said softly. "Do you?" Rose asked. "Because sometimes I see the way you look at me like you're seeing a ghost, and I understand we look alike, we sound alike, but I'm not her." Gabriel stared at her, struck by her directness. It was true there were moments when a certain gesture or expression of Rose's would catch him off guard, reminding him painfully of Margaret. But increasingly, He found himself noticing the ways in which Rose was different, her more animated way of speaking, her practicality, her quiet determination. "I know who you are, Rose," he said finally, "and I'm grateful you're here." Something softened in her expression. "Good," she said simply. "Now, would you like some coffee? It's too hot for the porch, but we could sit by the open window." They established a new pattern after that night. Gabriel made a point of helping with the evening chores, and their conversations gradually became less stilted. Rose told him about her life in St. Louis, her work as a teacher, and the letters Margaret had written describing their life on the ranch. "She was so proud of what you were building here," Rose said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching a summer storm roll in across the prairie. Every letter was full of plans for the future, expanding the herd, adding onto the cabin, starting a family. Gabriel's throat tightened. "We tried," he said quietly. "For a child, it didn't happen." Rose's expression was gentle. "She mentioned that. She said you were so patient, so kind about it. That's how I knew." "Knew what?" Gabriel asked when she didn't continue. Rose looked away, watching the lightning flicker on the horizon. "That you were a good man, the kind worth coming all this way for." The words hung between them, charged as the air before the storm. Gabriel felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the band of grief that had constricted his heart for months. Before he could respond, the first fat raindrops began to fall, and they hurried inside, the moment passing like the summer shower, brief but significant, leaving the air changed in its wake. Haying season ended, and the hired hands returned to town. The routine of the ranch continued, cattle to be moved to fresh pasture, a calf born late in the season needing extra attention, fences always requiring mending. But with Rose's help, the workload seemed more manageable than it had in months. Rose had settled into life on the ranch with surprising ease. She'd made curtains for the windows, tended the garden until it flourished, and established relationships with the women in town through the Ladies' Aid Society. On Wednesdays, Gabriel would drive her to town for the meetings, using the opportunity to handle ranch business while she sewed and socialized. One Wednesday in late July, Gabriel finished his business early and decided to check on Rose at Mrs. Peterson's house, where the society met. As he approached, he heard laughter from the open windows. Peering in, he saw Rose seated among a circle of women, her head thrown back in genuine mirth at something Mrs. Hawkins had said. The sight stopped him in his tracks. Rose looked so alive, so vibrant, her cheeks flushed with laughter, her hands gesturing expressively as she added something to the conversation that made the other women chuckle. Gabriel realized with a start that he'd never seen Margaret laugh like that with such abandon. Margaret's laughter had been gentle, restrained like everything else about her. The thought brought a wave of guilt. It felt like a betrayal to compare the sisters, to notice the ways in which Rose was different, perhaps even more suited to the harsh realities of ranch life with her practical nature and resilient spirit. Gabriel backed away from the window, troubled by the direction of his thoughts. He returned to the general store to wait for Rose, browsing items he didn't need to distract himself. When Rose found him there an hour later, her face was still animated from the social gathering. "Gabriel, I didn't expect you so soon. We had such a lovely time. Mrs. Thompson is expecting a baby, and we've been working on a quilt for her." Gabriel nodded, trying to focus on her words rather than the way her eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "That's nice. Are you ready to head back?" Rose nodded, then paused by a display of candy sticks. "Could we get some of these? I haven't had peppermint since I left St. Louis." The simple request, so human, so ordinary, struck Gabriel powerfully. When was the last time he'd thought about something as frivolous as candy? Margaret had loved peppermint too. "Of course," he said, selecting several sticks. "My treat." Rose's smile of delight was worth the few coins he handed to Mr. Peterson. On the ride home, she savored one of the candy sticks, offering another to Gabriel. The sweet peppermint flavor brought back memories of shared treats with Margaret during their courtship days. Margaret used to hide these around the cabin, he found himself saying. Said a little sweetness was important, even in the hardest times. Rose glanced at him, surprise evident in her expression. It was the first time he'd voluntarily shared a memory of Margaret. "That sounds like her," Rose said softly. "She always found ways to celebrate the small joys." Gabriel nodded, throat tight. "She did." They rode in silence for a while, the rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves a counterpoint to Gabriel's thoughts. Finally, he asked, "Do you miss teaching?" Rose considered the question. "Sometimes. I enjoy working with the children, watching them learn and grow." She gestured to the open landscape around them. "But there's something freeing about this life too, less constrained by social expectations." Gabriel raised an eyebrow. "Ranch life has its own constraints." "Yes, but they're honest ones dictated by necessity, by the seasons, by the needs of the animals, not by arbitrary social rules about how a lady should behave." Rose smoothed her skirt. "Though I suppose I've scandalized half the town already, living unchaperoned with a man who isn't my husband." Gabriel shifted uncomfortably. "Has anyone said something?" Rose laughed lightly. "Not to my face, and the ladies seem to have accepted the situation, given the circumstances." She glanced at him. "Does it bother you, what people might think?" Gabriel considered the question seriously. 2 months ago, the idea of impropriety would have troubled him greatly. Now, it seemed insignificant compared to the practical reality of their arrangement. "No," he said finally. "What matters is that the arrangement works for us. The rest is just talk." Rose nodded, seemingly satisfied with his answer. They completed the journey home in companionable silence, the shared peppermint stick a sweet memory between them. August arrived with a vengeance, bringing days so hot that the air shimmered above the parched grass. Gabriel worried about water for the cattle, checking the creek that ran through the property daily to ensure it hadn't dried up. Rose adapted to the heat by rising even earlier, doing most of the cooking and washing before the day grew too warm. She took to wearing her hair in a single braid down her back rather than pinned up, and simpler dresses made from the lightweight fabric she'd purchased in town. One particularly scorching afternoon, Gabriel returned from checking the eastern pasture to find the cabin empty. Concerned, he called for Rose, receiving no answer. Blue, who had taken to following Rose around nearly as much as he followed Gabriel, was also absent. Gabriel searched the garden and chicken yard with no success. A flutter of fear rose in his chest as he recalled how quickly illness had taken Margaret. He was about to saddle Rusty and search the property when he heard splashing from the direction of the creek. Following the sound, Gabriel made his way through a stand of cottonwoods to the deeper pool where the creek widened before continuing across his property. There, in the dappled shade, he found Rose. She was seated on a rock at the water's edge, her dress hiked up to her knees, feet dangling in the creek. Her hair was loose, still damp, suggesting she'd done more than just cool her feet. Blue lay nearby in the shade, panting happily. Gabriel stopped, suddenly aware that he was intruding on a private moment. He should announce his presence or leave, but he found himself momentarily transfixed by the sight of Rose's so unguarded head tilted back. Eyes closed, enjoying the simple pleasure of cool water on a hot day. A twig snapped beneath his boot and Rose's eyes flew open. She turned, spotting him among the trees, and hurriedly pulled her skirt down over her exposed legs. "Gabriel, I didn't hear you approach." Her cheeks flushed, whether from embarrassment or the heat, he couldn't tell. "I was looking for you," he said, stepping forward. "I was worried when you weren't at the cabin." Rose pushed her damp hair back from her face. "I'm sorry, it was so hot and the creek looked so inviting." She gestured to the clear water. "I hope you don't mind." "Of course not," Gabriel said, approaching to stand beside her rock. "It's a good spot for cooling off. Margaret and I used to," he broke off, the memory catching him by surprise. Rose watched him, her expression gentle. "Used to what?" Gabriel hesitated, then sat on a nearby rock, removing his hat. "We used to come here on hot days. Margaret would bring a picnic sometimes." Rose smiled. "That sounds lovely." Gabriel nodded, looking out over the water. It was. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the gurgle of the creek and the occasional chirp of birds in the cottonwoods. "You can talk about her, you know," Rose said quietly. "I'd like to hear your memories of her. It helps me feel closer to her too." Gabriel glanced at her, struck by the offer. He'd been so careful to avoid speaking of Margaret, fearing it would only deepen his grief or make Rose uncomfortable. But perhaps sharing the memories would help them both. She loved this spot, he said finally. Said it reminded her of a place she and you used to play as children. Rose's expression brightened. The stream behind old Mr. Finley's orchard, we'd sneak in and cool our feet on summer days. She laughed softly. Mr. Finley pretended to chase us off, but he always made sure we had an apple or two before we left. Gabriel smiled at the image of the sisters as young girls, carefree and mischievous. Margaret told me that story. Did she tell you about the time I fell in and ruined my new Sunday dress? Rose asked, eyes twinkling. Mother was furious, but Margaret took the blame, said she'd pushed me accidentally. She didn't mention that part, Gabriel said, his smile widening. Sounds like you were the troublemaker. Rose laughed, the sound bright and unrestrained. I was. Margaret was always bailing me out of some scrape or another. Her expression sobered slightly. She was the good one, always doing the right thing, thinking of others first. Gabriel nodded, recognizing the truth in that assessment. She was. Rose studied him for a moment, then said softly, "You must have loved her very much." "I did," Gabriel replied, the words coming easier than he expected. "She was gentle, kind, patient with my moods and long silences." He looked out over the water, memories washing over him like the current. "She made this place a home." Rose was quiet for a long moment. When Gabriel glanced at her, he was startled to see tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I didn't mean to upset you." Rose shook her head, wiping at her eyes. "You didn't, I'm just glad she was happy. That she had someone who loved her so well." The simple sincerity in her voice touched something in Gabriel. For the first time, he considered how difficult this must be for Rose as well, living in her sister's home, surrounded by reminders of her, trying to help a man still grieving her loss. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate for what he wanted to express. "For coming here, for helping. I know it can't be easy." Rose smiled through her tears. "Surprisingly, it is. Easy, I mean. Being here feels right somehow." She gestured to the creek, the trees, the open sky above them. "I understand now why Margaret loved it so much." They sat by the creek until the shadows lengthened, talking about Margaret, about their childhoods, about the simple pleasures and hardships of life. By the time they walked back to the cabin together, something had shifted between them, a new understanding, a deeper connection forged through shared grief and healing. That night, Gabriel dreamed of Margaret. Unlike the fevered nightmares that had plagued him for months, this dream was peaceful. Margaret stood in a sunlit meadow, smiling at him with love and what looked like permission in her eyes. When he woke, tears damp on his pillow, Gabriel felt lighter somehow, as if a burden had been partially lifted from his shoulders. The next few weeks passed in a haze of summer heat and increasingly comfortable companionship. Rose had fully integrated herself into the rhythm of the ranch, taking on responsibilities without being asked, anticipating needs before Gabriel voiced them. They worked well together, moving around each other in the cabin with an ease that spoke of growing familiarity. In town, Gabriel noticed people had stopped giving them curious looks. Rose's presence at his side had become accepted, expected even. At church, they sat together in what had become their pew, Rose's voice joining his in the hymns, her hand occasionally brushing his as they shared a hymnal. It was during one such service, as Rose sang beside him, that Gabriel was struck by a troubling realization. The agreed-upon 2 months had passed. According to their arrangement, Rose should be preparing to return to St. Louis for the start of the school year. The thought of her leaving, of returning to the empty cabin, the silent meals, the long evenings alone filled Gabriel with a cold dread that had nothing to do with the summer heat. When had her presence become so essential to his daily life? When had her smile, her laugh, her practical wisdom become something he looked forward to each day? These questions haunted him through the service and the ride home. Rose seemed to sense his preoccupation, leaving him to his thoughts as she prepared their Sunday dinner. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Gabriel finally broached the subject. "School will be starting soon in St. Louis," he said, keeping his voice carefully neutral. Rose nodded, her profile illuminated by the fading light. In 3 weeks, Gabriel's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. You'll be needing to leave soon, then. Rose was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. I suppose I will, she said finally, unless, Gabriel prompted when she didn't continue. Rose turned to look at him directly, her blue eyes searching his face. Unless there's a reason for me to stay. The simple statement hung between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Gabriel's heart hammered in his chest as he recognized the opening she was offering him. The ranch needs help, he said carefully. Winter preparations, fall roundup, it's a lot for one person. Rose's expression remained steady, but something flickered in her eyes, disappointment perhaps. Yes, I suppose it is. And Blue would miss you terribly, Gabriel continued, a faint smile tugging at his lips as the dog in question raised his head at the sound of his name. He's grown quite attached. Has he? Rose asked, her own lips curving slightly. I've grown rather fond of him too. Gabriel took a deep breath, gathering his courage. And I would miss you as well, Rose, more than I care to admit, Rose's breath caught audibly. Would you? Gabriel nodded, unable to look away from her face. These past months, having you here has made this place feel like home again. I don't want to lose that, I don't want to lose you. The admission cost him something, pride, perhaps, or the last vestiges of his grief-imposed isolation. But the way Rose's face softened, the hope that bloomed in her eyes, made it worthwhile. Gabriel, she said softly, are you asking me to stay? Yes, he said simply. I am. Rose reached across the space between their chairs, her hand finding his. Then I will. Gabriel turned his hand to clasp hers, marveling at the smallness of her fingers within his calloused palm. What about your teaching position? I'll write to the school board tomorrow, Rose said. They'll find a replacement. There are always young women looking for teaching positions. Gabriel frowned slightly. I don't want you to give up your career for this, for me. Rose's expression grew serious. I'm not giving up anything I value more than what I've found here. She squeezed his hand gently. But Gabriel, we need to be clear about what this means. What are you asking of me, to stay as your sister-in-law, your housekeeper? Or? She left the question unfinished, but Gabriel understood. The proper thing would be to offer marriage. It was the only way a single woman could remain indefinitely in a single man's home without scandal. But marriage meant acknowledging that what he felt for Rose was more than gratitude, more than friendship. It meant accepting that his heart had room for someone new, someone who wasn't Margaret. I don't know, he admitted honestly. I just know I want you to stay. Rose nodded, disappointment visible in her eyes even as she tried to hide it. I understand, it's too soon. Gabriel felt the weight of his inadequate response, but couldn't bring himself to offer more. Not yet, not when his feelings were still so tangled, so confused. Can that be enough for now? He asked quietly, just knowing that I want you here, that this place is better with you in it. Rose was quiet for a long moment, her gaze returning to the darkening horizon. Finally, she nodded. For now, she agreed, but Gabriel, I won't be your housekeeper indefinitely. I deserve more than that. You do, he agreed, relieved and troubled in equal measure. You deserve everything. Rose smiled faintly, withdrawing her hand from his. It's getting late, I should get some rest. Gabriel nodded, watching as she rose and went inside, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the emerging stars. He stayed on the porch long into the night, wrestling with emotions he'd thought buried alongside Margaret: hope, desire, the tentative possibility of a future he hadn't dared imagine. The next morning, Rose was up early as usual, preparing breakfast as if nothing had changed between them. But there was a new awareness in their interactions, a careful politeness that hadn't been there before. I'll ride into town today to post my letter to the school board, Rose said as they ate. Is there anything you need while I'm there? Gabriel shook his head. I'll go with you. I need to speak with Mr. Thompson about some business. Rose raised an eyebrow but didn't question him. They rode to town together, the journey passed mostly in silence. At the post office, Gabriel left Rose to her correspondence and made his way to the Reverend's house. Reverend Thompson received him warmly, ushering him into his small study. Gabriel, this is a pleasant surprise. What can I do for you today? Gabriel removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. I need some advice, Reverend, of a personal nature. The older man's expression softened. Of course, please sit down. Gabriel took the offered chair, struggling to find the right words. It's about Rose. Miss Vernon? Ah, the Reverend said, understanding immediately. I wondered if this might be the reason for your visit. Gabriel looked up, surprised. Was it that obvious? Reverend Thompson smiled kindly. To those with eyes to see, perhaps. There's been a change in you these past months, Gabriel. A return to life. Gabriel nodded slowly. That's her doing. She came when I was at my lowest, brought me back from a dark place. He hesitated. But it's been less than 6 months since Margaret died, isn't it? Wrong to have feelings for her sister. The Reverend considered the question carefully. The heart has its own timetable, Gabriel. Grief doesn't follow a prescribed schedule, nor does healing. He leaned forward. Tell me honestly, do your feelings for Rose diminish what you felt for Margaret? Gabriel shook his head immediately. No, never. Then perhaps you should consider that your capacity to love again honors Margaret's memory rather than betraying it. The Reverend's eyes were kind. Margaret wouldn't have wanted you to spend your life alone, drowning in grief. But her sister, Gabriel pressed, isn't there something improper about that? In biblical times, it was actually encouraged for a man to marry his wife's sister if she died, the Reverend pointed out. The practice ensured the widow was cared for within the family. He smiled gently. But that's not really your concern, is it? You're worried about what Margaret would think. Gabriel nodded, throat tight. How can I be sure she would approve? You can't, the Reverend said simply. But consider this, Margaret cared enough about both of you to ask Rose to come if anything happened to her. She trusted Rose to look after you, and trusted you to be kind to Rose. That suggests to me that she valued both your happiness above all. Gabriel sat with that thought for a moment, remembering his dream of Margaret, the peaceful smile, the sense of permission in her eyes. Perhaps his subconscious had already provided the answer he sought. Thank you, Reverend, he said finally, rising to his feet. You've given me much to consider. The Reverend stood as well, placing a hand on Gabriel's shoulder. Follow your heart, my friend, and remember love is never a betrayal. It's a gift, one that some are blessed to receive more than once in a lifetime. Gabriel left the Reverend's house with a lighter step, his mind clearer than it had been in months. He found Rose waiting for him outside the general store, a small package in her hands. I got more peppermint sticks, she explained with a small smile, and some fabric for a new dress. Gabriel nodded, taking the package from her to secure it in his saddlebag. As they mounted their horses for the ride home, he said, I've been thinking about our conversation last night. Rose glanced at him, her expression carefully neutral. Oh. I'd like to court you properly, Gabriel said, the words coming easier than he'd expected. If you're amenable. Rose's eyes widened slightly. Court me, Gabriel nodded, suddenly nervous. I know it's not conventional given our circumstances. And I can't promise where it might lead or how quickly, but I do know that my feelings for you are, more than gratitude, more than friendship. A slow smile spread across Rose's face, lighting her eyes with a joy that made Gabriel's heart skip. I would like that very much, she said softly. Good, Gabriel replied, returning her smile. Then may I take you to dinner at the hotel restaurant on Saturday as a proper start to our courtship? Rose laughed, the sound bright and happy. You may indeed, Mr. Porter. They rode home side by side, their horses matching pace, the future stretching before them like the open prairie, vast with possibility, rich with promise. The courtship that followed was unlike any Gabriel had experienced before. With Margaret, there had been the formal calls at her parents' home, chaperoned walks in the town park, careful conversations under watchful eyes. With Rose, they were already sharing a home, a daily life, the intimacy of proximity already established. Yet Gabriel insisted on observing certain proprieties. He moved his bedroll back to the barn, despite Rose's protests about the cooling autumn nights. He arranged for Mrs. Hawkins to accompany them on their Saturday dinner at the hotel restaurant, much to Rose's amusement. You do realize everyone in town already thinks we're living in sin, don't you? Rose teased as they drove to town that Saturday, Mrs. Hawkins chattering happily beside her. Gabriel's ears reddened. All the more reason to demonstrate our intentions are honorable. Mrs. Hawkins patted Rose's hand approvingly. Mr. Porter is quite right, my dear. It's never too late to observe the proprieties. The dinner itself was pleasant, if somewhat constrained by Mrs. Hawkins's presence. Gabriel found himself watching Rose across the table the way she engaged Mrs. Hawkins in conversation, her genuine interest in the older woman's stories, the graceful movement of her hands as she spoke. When had he started noticing these things about her? When had the sister of his dead wife become a woman in her own right in his eyes, someone whose smile could quicken his pulse, whose laughter could lighten his darkest thoughts? On the ride home, with Mrs. Hawkins safely delivered to her door, Gabriel and Rose fell into comfortable conversation beneath a canopy of stars. The September night was crisp, hinting at the winter to come. "I'll need to start preparing the ranch for winter soon," Gabriel said. Bringing the cattle closer to the home pastures, stocking up on supplies. Rose nodded. "I've been putting up preserves from the garden. The root cellar is nearly full." Gabriel glanced at her, struck again by her practical competence. "You've taken to ranch life remarkably well." Rose smiled. "I find I prefer it to city living. There's an honesty to the work, a clear purpose." She looked out over the darkened landscape, "and a beauty to the land that gets into your blood." "It does," Gabriel agreed. "That's what Margaret used to say too." He'd stopped censoring mentions of Margaret, finding that speaking of her freely somehow made it easier to separate his feelings for Rose from his memories of his wife. Rose seemed to appreciate this approach as well, often asking questions about Margaret's life on the ranch, filling in gaps in her understanding of her sister's final years. As they neared the homestead, Gabriel steered the wagon past the main house toward a small rise where he sometimes went to think. Rose looked at him questioningly. "There's something I want to show you," he explained, bringing the wagon to a halt. He helped her down, then retrieved a blanket from the back, spreading it on the ground. "Look up." Rose tilted her head back and gasped softly. The night sky was ablaze with stars, the Milky Way a brilliant smear across the blackness. With no town lights to dim the view, the heavens were revealed in all their glory. "It's magnificent," she breathed, turning slowly to take in the entire panorama. "I'd forgotten how many stars there are when you get away from the city." Gabriel watched her, entranced by the wonder on her face. This was always Margaret's favorite spot. She said it made her feel both small and significant at the same time. Rose nodded, still gazing upward. "I understand what she meant. Under a sky like this, our lives seem so brief, so tiny, yet we're part of all this vastness, connected to it somehow." Gabriel stepped closer, drawn by her insight, by the way she seemed to intuitively understand things he'd never properly articulated. "That's exactly what she said." Rose lowered her gaze to meet his, her eyes reflecting starlight. "We were sisters. We shared many thoughts, many feelings." She hesitated, then added softly, "But we were also different in important ways." Gabriel nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. "I've come to see that." They stood close together under the star-strewn sky, the moment heavy with possibility. Gabriel could feel the warmth of her nearness, could smell the faint lavender scent she favored. It would be so easy to lean down to close the distance between them. Instead, he stepped back slightly, mindful of his promise to court her properly. "We should head back. It's getting late." Rose's expression flickered with something disappointment, perhaps, but she nodded. "Of course." As Gabriel helped her back into the wagon, his hand lingered on hers longer than necessary. The simple contact sent a jolt through him, a reminder of how long it had been since he'd touched someone with anything approaching desire. The courtship continued through September and into October. Gabriel found small ways to demonstrate his growing affection, bringing wildflowers from the range, carving a new handle for her favorite cooking spoon, building shelves for her growing collection of books ordered from the catalog. Rose responded with her own gestures, a special pie made with the last of the summer berries, a new shirt sewn from fabric she'd purchased in town, companionable evenings reading aloud from one of her books while he whittled by the fire. They established a new routine, one that acknowledged the shift in their relationship. Sunday drives after church, Wednesday trips to town for her ladies' aid meetings, Saturday dinners at the hotel restaurant, with Mrs. Hawkins's presence gradually becoming less necessary. The people of Billings adjusted to the new reality as well. What had initially raised eyebrows, Gabriel Porter courting his dead wife's sister, gradually became accepted, even celebrated by those who had worried about the lonely widower. "You've brought him back to life," Mrs. Peterson told Rose one Wednesday as they stitched together on a quilt. "We all see it. The way he smiles now, the way he holds himself, it's like he's remembered how to live." Rose blushed at the comment but couldn't deny its truth. The Gabriel who had met her at the door that first day, gaunt, hollow-eyed, moving like a man twice his age, had been transformed. He still had his quiet moments, his occasional dark days when memories of Margaret weighed heavily. But increasingly, he looked forward rather than back, made plans for the future rather than dwelling in the past. It was during one such planning session, as they sat at the kitchen table discussing preparations for winter, that Gabriel finally voiced what had been on his mind for weeks. "I think we should add onto the cabin," he said, looking up from the list of supplies they were compiling. "Build a proper bedroom on the east side, expand the main room." Rose looked surprised. "That's a significant undertaking before winter," Gabriel nodded. "Not for this winter, for next year." He met her gaze directly. "For our future." Rose set down her pencil, her expression cautious. "Our future," Gabriel reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Rose, I've been courting you for nearly 2 months now. In that time, my feelings have only grown stronger, more certain." He took a deep breath. "I love you, not as Margaret's sister, not as a replacement for what I've lost, but as yourself, Rose Vernon, with your practical mind and generous heart and remarkable courage." Rose's eyes filled with tears, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I know it hasn't been a year since Margaret died," Gabriel went on. "Some might say it's too soon, but I've come to believe that life is too short, too precious to waste waiting for some arbitrary proper time." He squeezed her hand gently. "If you share my feelings, if you could see yourself building a life here with me, I'd like to ask you to be my wife." A tear slipped down Rose's cheek, followed by another. "Oh, Gabriel," she whispered, "I do love you. I've loved you for months, though I scarcely dared admit it to myself." She wiped at her tears with her free hand. "But are you certain, truly certain this is what you want?" Gabriel nodded, his own vision blurring slightly. "I've never been more certain of anything. You came to me when I was at my lowest, brought soup and a willing heart, and somehow healed what I thought was broken beyond repair." He smiled through his emotion. "Margaret sent you to me, I believe that, not to replace her, but to ensure I didn't spend the rest of my life drowning in grief." Rose's smile was radiant despite her tears. "She would have done that. She always was looking out for both of us." Gabriel rose from his chair, still holding her hand, and came around the table to kneel beside her. "Rose Vernon, will you marry me? Will you make this ranch your home, share my life, build a future with me?" Rose nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then she leaned down, framing his face with her hands. "Yes," she said simply. "With all my heart, yes." When their lips met for the first time, Gabriel felt a sense of rightness, of coming home after a long journey. Rose's kiss was both familiar and entirely new, a promise, a beginning, a healing. They were married on the first Sunday in November, with Reverend Thompson officiating in the small church in Billings. The entire town turned out for the occasion, filling the pews and spilling onto the church steps. Rose wore a simple dress of deep blue, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Gabriel, clean-shaven and nervous, waited at the altar in his best suit, Blue sitting dutifully beside him as an unconventional best man. As Rose walked down the aisle toward him, Gabriel felt a curious sense of Margaret's presence, not as a ghost or a shadow, but as a benediction. He could almost hear her voice. "Be happy, my loves, be happy together." When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the congregation was heartfelt and jubilant. Everyone present had witnessed Gabriel's journey from grief to healing, had seen the miraculous way Rose had brought life back to the ranch and its owner. The wedding celebration continued at the homestead, with neighbors bringing food and drink, musicians playing lively tunes for dancing, children chasing each other around the yard. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit, casting a golden glow over the gathering. Gabriel found Rose standing at the edge of the celebration, looking out over the land that was now officially her home as well. He slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her close. "Happy?" he asked softly. Rose leaned into him, her head fitting perfectly against his shoulder. "More than I ever thought possible." Gabriel pressed a kiss to her temple. "I was thinking about that first day when I came home and found you in the kitchen making soup." Rose laughed softly. "You looked like you'd seen a ghost." "I thought I had," Gabriel admitted, "but you weren't a ghost. You were exactly what I needed, though I was too stubborn to see it at first." Rose turned in his arms to face him. "And now," Gabriel smiled, tracing the curve of her cheek with gentle fingers. "Now I see clearly. I see you, Rose Porter, my wife, my heart, my future." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they sealed their new beginning with a kiss. Surrounded by friends and the land they both loved, the past honored but no longer a barrier to the joy that awaited them. Epilogue. 5 years later, Gabriel Porter stood on the porch of his expanded cabin, watching as the spring sun crested the eastern hills. The ranch had grown considerably in 5 years. More cattle, more acreage, a larger barn, a bunkhouse for the 2 hands he now employed year-round. But the most significant changes were inside the cabin itself. "Papa, Papa," a small whirlwind burst through the door, colliding with his legs. "Mama says breakfast is ready and you better come quick before Johnny eats all the pancakes." Gabriel laughed, scooping up his 4-year-old daughter. Maggie Porter had her mother's blonde hair and her father's green eyes, along with a determination that was entirely her own. "We can't have that, can we?" Gabriel said, settling her on his hip. "Your brother's appetite is bigger than he is." Inside, Rose stood at the stove, their 2-year-old son secured in a high chair nearby, his face already sticky with syrup. At 30, Rose had blossomed in motherhood, her practical nature perfectly suited to managing both the household and her energetic children. "There you are," she said, smiling as Gabriel entered with Maggie. "I was about to send out a search party." "Just watching the sunrise," Gabriel replied, setting Maggie down and crossing to kiss his wife good morning. "Thinking about how lucky I am." Rose's expression softened. "Sentimental this morning, are we?" Gabriel nodded toward the calendar on the wall where today's date was circled in red. "It's 5 years today since you arrived, 5 years since you appeared with soup and saved me." Rose's eyes misted slightly. "Has it really been that long?" "It has." Gabriel wrapped his arms around her waist, mindful of her growing belly where their 3rd child was making its presence known. 5 years of happiness I never thought I'd have again." Rose leaned into him, her head finding its familiar place on his shoulder. "We've built a good life, haven't we?" Gabriel looked around the warm kitchen at Johnny banging his spoon, at Maggie carefully setting the table, at Blue, now elderly but still faithful, dozing by the hearth, and felt a fullness in his heart that sometimes still took him by surprise. "The best life," he agreed, "one day at a time." Outside, the Montana morning unfolded in all its glory, the sun warming the earth. Cattle grazing in green pastures, wildflowers beginning to dot the prairie. Inside, the Porter family gathered around their table, saying grace, passing plates, laughing together, a testament to love's ability to heal, to rebuild, to create something beautiful from the ashes of loss. And somewhere, Gabriel liked to think, Margaret was smiling.